Okay, good morning again. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christine Denny, and I am one of the Grand Rounds co-directors, along with Drs. Kate Elkington and Jeff Miller. We have a few announcements before we begin, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Marissa Spann. Next week's Grand Rounds will be part of our Hot Topics series, and we are going to have 3 speakers next week. The first speaker is Dr. Philip Krenisky, an assistant professor of clinical medical psychology in psychiatry. We will also have Dr. Monica Kim, a T32 postdoctoral fellow in psychiatry, as well as Dr. Doran Salam, and an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry. Next week's sessions will be in person with an additional Zoom option. Lunch will be served for in-person attendees in the first floor auditorium outside where we have Grand Rounds at 12:30. Before I turn it over to Dr. Spann, I just want to remind and encourage everyone to post questions at any time during the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. This is separate from the chat. If you are a trainee, please put the word trainee at the beginning of your question, and we will prioritize these questions. Please also write so we know. You can ask the question yourself or prefer to have your question read at the end of your question. And if you are willing to ask the question yourself, we will temporarily promote you to a panelist so you can ask your question directly to our speaker, camera on or off, as you would prefer. And we think asking the question yourself adds to our sense of connection during these Zoom sessions, so we encourage you to do so. Today's Grand Rounds is part of our OEDI Addressing Structural Racism series, and I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Marissa Spann for the introduction of Dr. Paula Braveman. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marissa Spann, and I'm Acting Director of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I'm so excited to introduce our next Grand Round speaker that's part of our Addressing Structural Racism series. So Dr. Paula Braveman is a professor emeritus of family and community medicine and founding director of the Center for Health Equity at the University of California, San Francisco. For over 3 decades, she has studied and published extensively on health equity and the social determinants of health, and work with local, state, national, and international health agencies to bring attention to these issues domestically and internationally. Her research focuses on measuring, understanding, and addressing racial and socioeconomic disparities in health, particularly in maternal and infant health. She was elected to the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, in 2002. The title of her talk is Black-White Disparities in Preterm Birth, Race or Racism. Please join me in welcoming her, and Dr. Braveman, I will let you take over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spann. It's a real pleasure to be participating in your Grand Round series. So I'm going to ask for the slides to come up. That's great. So I'm going to be talking about the Black-White disparity in preterm birth and raising the question whether that disparity is explained by race or whether it's better explained by racism. Next slide, please. So for as long as statistics have been kept, there has been a sizable disparity in rates of preterm birth among European Americans, whites, and African Americans or Blacks. That disparity has been on the order of about 1.6, 1.5, 1.6 times the rate of preterm birth among births to African Americans compared to births to European Americans. And it would be difficult to identify a health indicator that's more important than preterm birth. It's a really strong predictor of infant mortality, one of the strongest predictors, but it is also a strong predictor of physical and mental and emotional disability in childhood and adulthood. And then with some coming from more recent research, the recognition that preterm birth is also strongly associated with chronic disease in adulthood, particularly heart disease and diabetes. It's a tremendous burden on families, and there are huge economic costs of preterm birth, and I'll be abbreviating it PTB throughout the slides. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, we don't have definitive knowledge of what the causes of these disparities, and I'll just be referring to the disparity, and I will mean by that the disparity between Black people and white people. So the causes of the disparities really are not known, and I want to underscore something here because there's a mistake that's frequently made, and I suspect it's not just in the area of disparities in preterm birth, but in general in thinking about health disparities, that a given cause may be an important cause of a given outcome, let's say preterm birth, yet not be a cause of the Black-white disparity in that outcome. To be a cause of the disparity, that factor would have to have been either more prevalent or have had a stronger effect in the one group than in the other. So please keep that in mind, that I'm talking about the disparity, the Black-white disparity in preterm birth. One of the bits of knowledge that's been very frustrating to a lot of people in the field is that the causes that I think were assumed to be the causes of preterm birth disparities have not panned out. I think for a long time, it was assumed that the disparity, the Black-white disparity in preterm birth must reflect disparities in the receipt of prenatal care, but that there is a ton of research really that indicates that that's not true. Similarly, there have been a lot of assumptions made, and I would say those assumptions reflect racism, that the Black-white disparity was due to substance abuse. And that has been, like the standard prenatal care as a cause, that has been studied in many different studies and disproved. There is no indication that substance abuse explains the difference in preterm birth rates across comparing African Americans and European Americans. But I think much to the surprise of many people, research has shown that neither current income nor one's educational level explain the preterm birth disparities. The Black-white disparity in preterm birth is seen even after adjusting for current income, for education, for tobacco use, alcohol use, illicit drug use, and for standard prenatal care. And I should have mentioned back a slide ago that by preterm birth, what is meant is delivery before 37 completed weeks of gestation. Okay. So although the causes of the Black-white disparity are not known definitively, there are many hypotheses about what might explain the disparity, and I've listed them here, and I'm not going to reiterate them for the most part. Most of these hypothetical causes, except to draw your attention to a couple of them. And I can see that there's a a typo by the word, which should be the word genes, 3 items up from the bottom, and racism as a hypothetical cause. So a lot of people who have thought about these issues have assumed that the explanation for the Black-white disparity must be genetic because it's still there after you control for prenatal care, substance abuse, and current income or education. But I want to tell you that there is not evidence to back that up. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary. I was part of an expert working group that the March of Dimes convened a couple of years ago to look at the Black-white disparity in preterm birth, and happily on the panel in that working group, there were 4 people who had genetics expertise specifically, and they were charged with really studying the literature and answering the question, is it plausible that genetic differences between Blacks and whites could explain the Black-white disparity in preterm birth? And what they concluded was that the effects of any genetic differences were small, if any. So it not even clear that the small effects were there, and that genetic differences could not explain. I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience that the issue of genetic differences between Blacks and whites is a very sensitive issue, and that's because white supremacists have often invoked underlying differences, underlying physiologic differences, underlying genetic differences, as a reason for them holding their white supremacist thoughts. So that's not just any old disparity that or potential explanation for the disparity there. That is one that is very, very, very loaded. And I would say, although so many people have made that assumption, no one has identified the gene or genes, and there is a lot of evidence that that's not the explanation. Genetic differences are not the explanation. However, gene-environment interactions are thought, I think, by thoughtful experts in the area. Gene-environment interactions are thought to be very plausible, very biologically plausible. And I would say that all of these other potential causes of preterm birth disparities that I've listed here on the right side of this slide, all of these have been, I think one can say that there is a credible literature by credible sources to support some role for each one of these factors, the ones above the genes. And now at the bottom there of the list, I've put racism, and I would say that in the field again, and particularly among people who've studied the issue a lot, there is an increasingly widely held thought that that racism including structural or systemic racism, as well as interpersonal racism, is a very plausible explanation. And one of the things that makes it very plausible is that racism actually could explain why each one of the factors listed above genes, why that factor, what it is that triggers that factor. And I don't know how much of you remember from your high school science being taught about Occam's razor. I remember that from my high school science, and precious little else, unfortunately, but do that. And that's this notion that if you have competing possible explanations for a given phenomenon, and one of those explanations is it's complicated and there are lots of pieces to it, and then you have another explanation that is simple, that you should always favor the simpler explanation, and so I think it is very meaningful that we don't have time during this lecture to go through each one of these, but it is very possible to trace the pathways and then ultimately the biological mechanisms from racism to each one of these other potential causes. So next slide, please. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that social causes are very much involved in the racial disparity in preterm birth. And among the pieces of evidence that I think are very compelling is the finding that was first shown by Richard David and Jimmy, I'm blanking on his last name, another researcher in Chicago, showing that Black immigrants from Africa have birth outcomes that are very similar to those of US-born whites. And the reason that that's pretty compelling, if you think about it, if the Black-white difference in preterm birth were due to genetic differences, you would expect the Black immigrants from Africa to have worse outcomes because their genes have not been mixed in the way that African Americans, Black people born in the US, have that admixture between the white and the Black over the generations. And yet the Black immigrants from Africa have birth outcomes that really are not distinguishable from those of white people born in the US. Another piece of evidence that points towards social causes are that in many studies, the disparities have varied. They've varied in magnitude, mainly, with features of the neighborhood. Again, reflecting likely social causes. In addition, if you just look at poor women and you compare poor Black and poor white women on their birth outcomes, among the poor, there is no racial disparity in preterm birth. And I think that's another piece of evidence that is very hard to reconcile with a theory about genetic differences. In addition, there is a by now large and growing body of research that has linked experiences of racial discrimination with preterm birth. And its body of research has looked at a wide array of kinds of experiences of racial discrimination, including actually being treated unfairly, experiencing insults, experiencing threats, and vigilance, the need to be constantly on guard because there's a perceived risk that there will be a threat or an insult or unfair treatment. So there is actually by now quite a body of literature just looking at vigilance that reflects racism-related stress. And then in a lot of the literature on the Black-white disparity, stress has seemed to be featured often to play an important role. So again, suggesting that the place to look is in the social realm rather than in the genetic or underlying biological realm. So next slide, please. Let's see. So discrimination in housing is no longer legal, but the legacy of Jim Crow endures in pervasive racial segregation. So segregation tracks Black people into neighborhoods that are less healthy in many ways, including exposure to pollution, to unhealthy foods, and the stress of living in deteriorating areas with concentrated poverty and the desperation that often accompanies it. This affects not only poor, but many middle-class African Americans. Segregation cuts Black people off from services, from good schools, from decent jobs, from economic opportunity. And all of these perpetuate socioeconomic status and poor health across generations. And all of this can happen even without any individual consciously intending to discriminate, because it is structural racism. That is racism that is built into structures such as policies, laws, established practices, entrenched beliefs. And low socioeconomic status in itself could affect preterm birth risk in many ways, including poor nutrition, toxic exposures, and the stress of constantly facing daily challenges like childcare, transportation, and feeding and sheltering your family without adequate resources. But most studies measure socioeconomic factors very inadequately, often just one measure, at best two measures, which is not enough. And I'm focusing on this partly because of this issue of unmeasured differences, partly because I want to speak to those who still assume that the Black-white difference in preterm birth must be due to underlying biological differences, since it's still there after controlling for prenatal care and income and education and substance use. So next slide, please. So I want to highlight the issue of unmeasured differences. And let me give you a few examples of what I mean by systemic and structural racism in the context of preterm birth. Some of the kinds of structural racism that are very plausibly involved in the Black-white disparity in preterm birth. And these include the racial residential segregation, which I just talked about, but they also include other structural barriers or manifestations of structural racism, include the many obstacles to accumulating wealth, which then result through some intermediate steps, but result in schools, local schools being under-resourced, because because schools depend to a large extent on local property taxes. So if you have fewer homeowners and owning homes of lower value, in a segregated area, then, which is what happens when you face systemic obstacles to accumulating wealth. The ultimate consequence of that is under-resourced local schools. Other manifestations of structural racism that could be involved in the disparity in preterm birth include biased policing and biased sentencing. I think it's been very well documented what the biases are there. Also environmental injustice, because differences in exposure to environmental toxins, which were on that list that I showed you in the, what was it, the second slide, the third slide, that's where there is among the most consistent and extensive literature tying toxic environmental exposures to preterm birth. And environmental injustice, of course, means that then people of color are systematically more exposed to those environmental toxins. And can't talk about structural racism without mentioning gerrymandering and voter suppression, which robs people of color of the ability to influence the policies that result in resource allocation. Okay, so systemic and structural racism have systematically constrained African Americans' economic opportunities, and that results in less favorable education, less favorable employment, less income, less wealth, and less neighborhood economic advantages, all starting in infancy. And I should say that with preterm birth, as with many other health outcomes, it is, I think it's accepted at this point that you have what is referred to as life course effects, that the relevant exposures are not just during pregnancy, that the relevant exposures begin in a woman's childhood and continue through her life course. So how often do you see papers that conclude that an observed racial difference in health, regardless of the outcome, that these observed racial differences in health must reflect underlying biological differences or behavior, because the researchers saw the racial difference after they controlled for socioeconomic status? And I put the quote marks around the controlled for SES because it is not possible to control for socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status is too multifaceted. It's not just your income or your education, but both, and your accumulated wealth, the quality of your education, not just the quantity, but the quality of your education, your neighborhood socioeconomic conditions, and your parents' education, income, and wealth when you were a child. And there's a literature on each one of these associations that I've just mentioned. It is all of these factors, meaning socioeconomic status, is all of these factors and more throughout a person's life, and no one can capture all of it. Because of racism, at the same level of education, Black and Latino people have far less income than whites. And at the same income, Black and Latino people live in poorer neighborhoods and have a fraction of the accumulated wealth. And all of these differences can affect health. It's well documented in literature, yet these factors are rarely measured. Yet studies often conclude that a racial difference is genetic if it persists after control for socioeconomic status. So we should say what we have controlled for. I controlled for income, I controlled for education, or I controlled for accumulated wealth, and not that I have controlled for socioeconomic status, because it's just not possible. And often, because there often is so much unmeasured socioeconomic difference in health studies, the race variable often ends up capturing a lot of that unmeasured socioeconomic difference. And the socioeconomic difference is due to racism, both structural racism and interpersonal. So the next slide, please. So I've just noted how structural racism in particular could lead to preterm birth by lowering socioeconomic status, but racism also could plausibly affect preterm birth through the direct psychological effects of experiencing, anticipating, or just being aware of unfair treatment of your group. And all of these can be stressful. And there is literature that has demonstrated that measured the stress associated with different experiences of racism. And it's not just dramatic incidents, it's the cumulative effects of daily experiences that may be subtle or ambiguous. So the effects of having to be constantly vigilant for a slight or insult, whether they are intended or not, and the cumulative effect of countless little assaults on one's self-esteem. Or maybe it's the effects of learning that yet another unarmed Black man has been killed by the police and wondering whether your husband or your son is next. So chronic stress, even at a low level, is biologically plausible, highly plausible biologically, as a contributor to preterm birth through neuroendocrine and immune mechanisms. And neuroscientists have identified physiologic pathways leading from stress to health damage, including effects on inflammation and immune system functioning that are well known to trigger labor. And just as an example of this, my colleagues and I found in a large population-based study published a few years ago that the Black-white disparity in preterm birth was no longer significant after adjusting for whether a woman often worried about being treated unfairly based on her race. So how many health studies have you read that measured people's experiences of racism and measured experiences of racism in general, or any one of the different sort of types of racism, the structural, interpersonal, internalized, et cetera. So I will bet that none of you, or very few of you, have seen health studies, unless this is your area of research, studies that actually measure experiences of racism. So this is another potentially very important unmeasured difference. And I want to underscore something about chronic stress, that what neuroscientists have found is that chronic stress, even when it's at a kind of an undramatic or relatively low level, that chronic stress seems to be what does the results in the physiologic damage. So more so than a dramatic acute stressor in most cases. Okay, so the next slide, please. Thank you. And this is just an animation, a depiction of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which I know is quite familiar to most of you, that basically we experience a stressor that's registered in the hypothalamus, which sends chemical signal to the pituitary gland, which sends a chemical signal to the adrenals, which then pump out cortisol. And again, it seems to be the exposure to chronic high levels of cortisol that leads to inflammation, immune suppression, and then in turn to chronic disease and premature aging. And I also want to make it clear that the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is not the only one of the physiologic mechanisms that neuroscientists have clarified is involved in the body's response to stress. There are other mechanisms and other, and cortisol isn't the only one of the substances that's important. But this is just an illustration. So that the next slide, please. I mentioned this earlier, that there are many studies actually that have linked stress, not only linked stress with preterm birth, but stress due to experiences of racism, considering various forms of experiences of racism. And it has involved a diverse range of experience, from physical violence and overt insults, which are pretty obvious that those would be stressful, but also the more subtle and or ambiguous kinds of offenses, and to vigilance. As an example of the role that vigilance is thought to play, I just mentioned this in the previous slide, that my colleagues and I did a study where we were able to look at over 10,000 women, a population-based sample of women in California, and found that preterm birth was twice as likely among the African-American women who reported that they often worried about being treated unfairly because of their race, compared to otherwise similar African-American women who did not often worry. So the ones who did not often worry, it was either that they said that it happened rarely or not at all. And we found that evidence of vigilance, the association with preterm birth, even after taking into account a lot of economic factors, but I would never claim that we controlled for socioeconomic status in totality, but we probably had more economic measures in our models than the vast majority of researchers, because it's what we study. And taking into account not only economic factors, but also psychosocial factors, behavioral and medical factors, because we had an excellent source of information on a wide range of these characteristics. So next slide, please. Okay, so, and this is my final slide, and I am looking forward to the Q&A with you. So I have tried to make the point that racism may be an important contributor to the Black-white difference in preterm birth and other adverse health outcomes through at least two major pathways. So the first pathway I label as economic or socioeconomic, and that's an indirect pathway, so that racism could indirectly lead to higher rates of preterm birth among African-American women by tracking Black people into greater financial hardship, leading to, which in turn then financial hardship leads to chronic stress and also to unhealthy exposures. Because if you're you have very limited economic means, then you don't, the neighborhood in which you may be able to live, you're closed off from many, and you may only be able to afford living in the neighborhood that is environmentally toxic, with pollution, air pollution, ground pollution. So that's what I would mean by the financial hardship leading to unhealthy exposures as well as to chronic stress. And then secondly, the second major kind of pathway that could lead from racism to the Black-white disparity in preterm birth is more direct, and that's through the direct psychological effects of unfair treatment. And both of these kinds of pathways can occur even when no one intends to discriminate, because it's built into the structures, the structural racism. And neither one of these issues, the role of socioeconomic factors and the role of the psychological effects of untreatment, neither one of these is usually measured at all or adequately in health studies. And I've been focusing on preterm birth, but the key points that I'm trying to make, particularly about plausible causal pathways from racism to health damage and about unmeasured differences, these key points are relevant to a wide range of health outcomes, particularly chronic disease, where the roles of inflammation and immune dysfunction are believed to be very important, as they are in preterm birth. So in closing, I want to appeal to you that when you read studies or when you design studies and analyze your data, if you do so with studies that include variables representing race, that you need to be aware that regardless of what else it may represent, the race variable is likely picking up the totality of unmeasured experiences that a person of that race may have had throughout their life course, which could have had health effects. And even the smartest researcher in the world could have measured at best only a tiny fraction of those experiences, which could be highly, highly relevant. So I want to urge you to ask, always to ask, when you read studies or when you conduct them, are you looking at the effects of race, or are you looking at the effects of racism when you observe a racial difference in health? So I will stop there and look forward to the Q&A exchange.